in this book, especially the chapter 8. The ram, the goat, and the horn of chapter 8. This is an interesting thing about chapter 8. That Jesus himself over in Matthew said, therefore, when he's talking to his disciples about a question that they had asked, and that question was, when shall these things be? Remember that question in Matthew chapter 24? They were asking Jesus when the end would come. When would these things be? And his answer to that question was, when you see the abomination of desolation, which is spoken of through Daniel, the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. So he mentions this chapter so many years later in the book of Matthew, and I just thought that was pretty cool. Daniel chapter 8 speaks of several things. Number one, a vision of the ram and the goat. We're going to talk about that a little bit. A vision of the little horn. And then the interpretation of the visions toward the end of the chapter. So you're going to get the vision, and then you're going to get some help on the interpretation of the vision, and then he's going to talk about the ram in Daniel 8:20, and then the goat in the remaining of the chapter of this book. And then we're going to get Daniel's reaction to the vision itself toward the end of it. Now, here we have the vision of the ram, the horns that are unmatched, and the goat and with one horn. So we got a kind of a unicorn goat. Unicorn. We're down on this image about to right here between Persia and Greece. It's where we're at in this. The places, this place is a microscope down between the second and the third world empires, and a struggle between the east and the west, between Media Persia and Greco-Macedonian empires. Again, you see that? That's where we were here, and now we've made our way down to a struggle between these two empires right here. One's past, one is passing on to Greece, then eventually into the Roman era, of which we still are partially in the Roman era today. And so just remember that when Daniel was having this vision, he lived 400 years prior to this vision that he had. And a lot of these things were not even in existence at his time. We were talking about it raining 40 days and 40 nights, and Noah, earlier Ben and I was discussing this, and Noah had never seen rain. And when he's telling everybody it's going to rain, everybody's like, yeah, what is rain? And so it was a thing of believing something was going to happen that had never happened. And so we're living in an era of time when it's hard for us to imagine something like this happening, but it's going to happen. And it has been, it's pre-written history that we've been talking about. So let's get into it a little bit. In the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, to Daniel, after one that appeared to me the first time. And so this is like a couple years later. And he says, while I was looking, I was in Shushan, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. Then I lifted my eyes and I saw, and there standing beside the river was a ram, which had two horns. And the two horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and a higher one came up last. So he's been transported about 250 miles away to this river, to the event that was taking place in his vision. And he says that he was looking, and that he was suddenly found himself completely in a different location in the vision. And God was taking Daniel to the location of the events that were going to unfold in this vision that he was having. And so the vision was given during the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar. So we have to back up to about the 7th chapter. It's when this vision actually occurred. Then 2 years after the vision of chapter 7, he gets this vision. And it's also that the details of this vision concern the world empires that had not, at the time it was given, risen to dominance. So he's having a vision about something that's going to happen that hadn't happened yet. And so it was very, very hard for Daniel to understand what was going on and what was being said in this vision. And he lifted his eyes and he saw a ram which had two horns. And later we're made to understand that this was a picture of the Media Persian Empire on the multi-metallic image. It had two horns, one represented Media and the other Persia. Both horns were high, but one grew higher than the other and came up last, since Persia later gained greater dominance over the empire. That's why it came up last in the vision, because it represents this empire. And while Daniel considered the ram, another beast came into the scene, a male goat, or a he-goat, came up from the west, whom we're told later is Greece, in verse 21. And the zodiac, I know a lot of you guys follow this, the signs. It's interesting that Aries is the ram, if you follow the zodiac signs. And if you follow that ram back to its origins, it goes back to Persia. Isn't that interesting? That we're living in this day, and you have the zodiac signs. I've seen somebody posted zodiac signs on Facebook yesterday. And so a lot of you follow that. So here it is. It has nothing to do with the Bible, but I thought it was a colorful illustration. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no animal could withstand him. Nor was there any that could deliver from his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. And matter of fact, he became great, Alexander the Great. Does it make sense to you now? He became great, Alexander, what they called him the Great. And as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west, crossed the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. He was going so fast, he was coming so fast that it seemed like his feet wasn't even touching the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. He was a unicorn horn. You got the goat coming so fast, his legs are not even touching the ground. And he's coming out at this ram. And we know this to be Alexander the Great, according to history. While Daniel considered this ram, another beast came into the scene, a male goat coming from the west, Greece. And this is a remarkable goat because he's got this one horn. You've never seen a goat with just one horn, but here we got a unicorn goat in this vision. He only has this one prominent horn. The horn, we're told, is the first king of the Grecian Empire, and that is Alexander the Great. He is that horn. And looking at the proper interpretation, the ram with two horns, the kings of Persia and Media. That's the two horns. And one's kind of bigger than the other, we're told. One's higher than the other. And it's because there's the successive kings of this kingdom. And so you've got the he-goat in a single horn, the king of Greece, Alexander the Great. And the broken horn, again, refers to his death. He died about 32 years old. This king did. He was great, but he didn't last long. And then he came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him, and with furious power, and I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his two horns. Back to those two kings. And there was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him down to the ground, and he trampled him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. Therefore the male goat grew very great. But when he became strong, the large horn was broken, the death. And then in place of it was four notable ones that came up. This is four more kings. See how this vision is going? This becomes the horns become the kings. Horn denotes power. He's cut off about 31 BC at 32 years of age. After that, he's got four generals that take his place. Cassander to the west, Lysimachus to the east, Ptolemy to the south, and Seleucus to the north. These are the four kings, or the four horns that they represent. And so you've got these rams, and they're pushing in these three directions. Pushing in three directions. Then in verse 9, out of them came the little horn, which grew exceedingly great to the south, to the east, and to the glorious land. We know the glorious land is where? Israel. And it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the hosts and some of the stars to the ground, and it trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away. Now keep in mind, guys, that this event that we're talking about today is not in the Old Testament. It's not in the New Testament. Where's it at? It's between the two. It's what we call the Maccabean era. There was a time of history between the Old Testament, about 400 years, that nothing was said really or written, and then the New Testament starts. All that we're talking about right now is the events between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and we call it the Maccabean era. That's when Alexander the Great came to power. That's when all these events took place. And it says the daily sacrifices were taken away. So they came in and they made these priests stop offering sacrifices. They closed down the religious services. And in place of a sanctuary was cast down because the horn was opposing the daily sacrifices. There was a sacrifice in the morning, there was a sacrifice in the evening. It had been like that since the book of Genesis. There was always a sacrifice in the morning and a sacrifice in the evening. They did it every day, 2 sacrifices, all those years. And now this emperor, he is going to stop them from doing it. And it's happening between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I think it's very interesting. Out of these 4 came a little horn which grew exceedingly great. And we're made to know who this is by the fact that it grew toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land, that's Palestine, to the west and what we would call today modern Syria. Anybody heard of Syria in the news today? This is like all the time, right? And this means that the horn is from the north. So here we have the ram, the goat, and we've talked about the little horn here, who is exceedingly great, and he's pushing toward the south, the east, the glorious land, and he's even trying to overthrow God by stopping these daily sacrifices, and as high as the prince of the host, which is God himself. So where will the Antichrist come from? Did that ever enter your thinking? Where is the Antichrist going to come? I know every one of you have been thinking about that, right? You woke up this morning. Where is that Antichrist coming from? Right? I'm sure it was on your mind. And here we are, we're going to talk about it, right? How many's ever heard of the Antichrist? You've heard of the Antichrist? Okay. All right. Do you believe that he could come in our day? Yeah, he could. I mean, he's probably alive someplace, you know? He's probably waiting. A lot of people think that he will come from Greece. What is in Greece today? What is it? Greece right here. This is Rome, right? And so there's a lot of people that think the Catholic Church will represent the Antichrist, or the Pope could be the Antichrist. I personally don't think so. I think that he's going to come from around Turkey, which to me is more north of Israel. So that's something you can study up on and try to come up with the facts of it. I think it's interesting to know where he's going to come from, whether he's going to come from Greece, or where he's going to come from Turkey. But he's going to come from someplace in that area north of Israel. We know for a fact that we'll come from north of Israel. We know that much. So, and if you're watching the news and you hear about these countries, like you've heard in Turkey a lot today, like he's gaining power, the leader of Turkey is, and he's becoming a dictator real quickly over there in Turkey. And he could be setting himself up for this guy that's going to step in and be the next ruler of Turkey. It could be happening right now. We don't know. Here's an interesting fact about prophecy. Prophecy sometimes have what we call a double fulfillment. That means that it happens then, and then it happens again later on in history. It has a near fulfillment and a far-reaching fulfillment. And that's this prophecy. This prophecy has a double fulfillment, or like a bifocal kind of situation. And you can see, if you put up there Antiochus, this king now that we're talking about, the little horn, he is what we would call a type of Antichrist. And you can see that he really does accomplish the same things that the Antichrist will accomplish. Although he's talking about destroying thousands, there was thousands of Jewish people killed during this New Testament, Old Testament period. But in these days, we're told that millions of Christians will be killed. Even today, there's a lot of persecution going on around the world. But during the 7-year period of time, there's going to be millions of Christians killed and beheaded and murdered because of their faith in Christ. And so there's a near-term fulfillment. It happened in history, but it's going to happen again in the longer-term fulfillment. So there's a lot of things that we can contrast it to. So it refers to the 8th king of the Seleucid dynasty, that is Antiochus Epiphanes, who came to the throne about 175 BC. He was a prototype of the Antichrist in the Bible. That's that double fulfillment. Both involve two end-time events before Jesus came in the New Testament. Before he came, this was taking place. There was a heavy persecution of God's people right before Jesus was born. Do you see how it's going to be that again? He's coming back for a second time, and right prior to his return, there's going to be some heavy persecution of God's people. You see how that time in the inner period of the New and Old Testament is going to be exactly like the end time of the New Testament. There's going to be a lot of persecution of God's people right before he comes. Just like he did the first time, he's going to come the second time and find all this turmoil going on and his people being killed. He's going to step in, he's going to stop it. And so there's two periods of persecution. Both persecuted the saints of God. So a lot of parallels between this persecution of this emperor and the Antichrist. He was kind of a type of Antichrist. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that one, and this is Gabriel, by the way. This is the angel Gabriel. His name means holy man of God. That's what Gabriel means. How long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of the desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? How long is this going to last is the question. And he said to me, for 2,300 days. Pretty specific portion of time. Now, in the literal, matter of fact, it was interesting that in the 8th chapter of the book of Daniel, this is written in the Hebrew language. But in the chapters 1 through 7 was written in the Aramaic language. But all of a sudden in chapter 8, we go back to the Hebrew, of which the rest of the Old Testament was written. Isn't that interesting? That they translated into the Aramaic originally, but in chapter 8, it goes back to the Hebrew language. And so we're now back in the Hebrew language. And it is for 2,300 days. And literally it means mornings and evenings. And that goes back to the sacrifice. There was a sacrifice in the morning, a sacrifice in the evening. If you cut that in half, that would be like 1,150 days if you looked at it from that point of view. But if you counted if it's literally a 2,300 days, that's about 6 years and 3 months. Just kind of short of 7 years, which is what the tribulation period is going to be. So I thought that was interesting. That is that close to the 7-year period of tribulation. He even exalted himself against the God of Israel and eliminated the daily sacrifices, defiled the temple, and that's this guy right here. His reign was about 6 1/3 years. Interestingly enough, he reigned for about 2,300 days. And that's exactly what Gabriel said would happen. His reign of terror began in 171 BC and ended on December 25th, 165, through the revolt of the Maccabees, at which point the temple sacrifices were restored. Again, we're in that intertestamental period of time. He actually was the brother of Cleopatra. You ever heard of Cleopatra? He was her brother. Wow. Now you can go home and say, hey, I found out who Cleopatra's brother was. But here's some things that he did. I'll just pass it up. Hanukkah. Anybody ever heard of Hanukkah? Yeah. What is that?
Jewish holiday.
It's a Jewish holiday. When did this start? Right here. It started right here when they restored the temple sacrifices. After the 2,300 days, Joseph Maccabees came in and restored the temple and restarted the sacrificial offerings morning and evening. And so the Jewish people, from that day to this day today, every year they celebrate Hanukkah. And Hanukkah goes back to this event. Isn't that interesting? So if anybody ever asks you about Hanukkah, you say, well, I know about that. I know exactly why that happened. The Hebrew word means dedication. It commemorates the rededication of the Jerusalem temple during the winter of 164 BC. After it had been occupied by the Greek persecutors, it had been defiled by Greek. They had erected the statue of the Greek king that looked like Zeus on the large temple altar. They had sacrificed pigs. You know, Jewish people don't eat pork. So this was ultimate defamation. They sacrificed pigs on the temple altar. So here Gabriel interprets the vision. In verse 15 it says, then it happened when Daniel, had seen the vision and was seeking the meaning that suddenly, I mean, he did just walk up. He was out of thin air. He suddenly appeared, this angel Gabriel. Matter of fact, here's an interesting point. This is the first time in the Old Testament he's ever been mentioned. So it's called the importance of the first mention in the Bible. It's never been mentioned before. All of a sudden we have Gabriel being mentioned here in the 8th chapter of the book of Daniel. And it happened, he suddenly appeared, and there stood before me one having appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of Uriah, who called and said, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, there in this war scene, this zone, this vision. And I was afraid, and I fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, son of man, that the vision refers to the end time. You see, Gabriel said to Daniel, this is not going to happen very soon. This is the vision that's speaking about the very end of time. Way up yonder. Now, you and I are living today in this end of time. He said, now this refers to the people out there at Real Life Ministries Church over there. And Rick's going to be telling you the rest of it here after a while. So go ahead. That's not in there. That's the new translation. That's the message. Yeah. Now, as he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and stood me upright. And he said, look, I'm making known to you what shall happen in the later time of the indignation. For at that appointed time, the end shall be. The ram which you saw having 2 horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. See, he's interpreting the vision now for Daniel. Thank you. And the male goat is the king of Greece. That's Alexander the Great. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. As for the broken horn and the 4 that stood up in its place, that's 4 kingdoms. That's going to rise out of that one nation. And we know in history that that was exactly what happened. And in the later time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. In other words, here's a man that's going to walk on this earth in flesh and blood, but he's going to have knowledge of eons of time that have passed. You see, you and I live short lives. Some of us real short lives, right? Some of us here 20 years, some 30 years. Some of us are privileged to live a little longer, but we only know what we learn in this very short window of time that we're here in this world. We try to teach our children. One of the things that Emily had said when she started coming to church some years ago here, I want Avery to know the Bible. She's starting at a very, very early age learning the Bible. And this is a good place to be for that because, man, this is what we call a Bible teaching church. We teach the Bible. And so this man that's going to come, according to Gabriel, it says that he's going to understand sinister schemes. He's going to have in his mind the understanding of how wars have been fought and won throughout the eons of time. And when he comes in this little short life that he's going to be given, he's going to have all this powerful knowledge here in our day in which we live. And he'll be using that knowledge against the world to accomplish. Think about Alexander the Great. He died at 32 years old. But look at all the things he accomplished in that short period of time. He obviously has some kind of supernatural, spiritual understanding or, something from someplace outside of human ability. But here's the problem. Through his cunning, his knowledge, his understanding, he will cause deceit to prosper under his rule, and he shall exalt himself in his heart, and he shall destroy many in their prosperity, and he shall even rise against the prince of the princes, which is Jesus Christ himself. He will become the Antichrist. But he shall be broken without human means. I think that's interesting. He shall be broken without human means. In other words, nobody's going to kill him. God's going to take care of him. That's what's going to happen to this guy. Not by human means. God's going to take him out. That's what's going to happen. And that's what the Bible says, right? There's going to be a war. It's going to be between Jesus Christ and the Antichrist, and God's going to take him out. I think it won't be on God's side. I think I've read the end of the book, and I know who wins. When I was growing up, they always put me on the losing team. You're standing there by yourself and you're the last one chosen there. I guess I'll take Rick. Okay, whatever. You know. And I finally realized the reason they lost is because I was on their team. So I was the weak link. Daniel was seeking the meaning of these things and is given an authoritative explanation by the angel Gabriel. And that's back over, he's mentioned in Luke chapter 1. The angel Gabriel told Daniel the prophet that the closer we come to the second coming, the more God would reveal about the end times to his people. Now that's interesting. He's saying, you might not understand it now, nor will anybody live and understand it right now, but the people in the end times, they're going to have a clearer understanding of everything that we're talking about. Why would we have a clearer understanding? Because we can look back in history and see it, how it unfolded now, and kind of put it together, all of that knowledge. So Daniel, he's overwhelmed by the vision. But he's strengthened in order to be given the interpretation. Man, I mean, he's just wore out with all this stuff. His brain is burning up. And he is told that these things relate to the kingdoms of the Media, Persia, and Greece, but he's also told that they concern things that pertain to the end. The end, that double fulfillment, that bifocal, that near fulfillment and later. And so this king is a type of the coming Antichrist. Here's all the things. He'll cause the craft to prosper in his hand. He'll magnify himself in his heart. He'll stand up against the Prince of Peace. And this is all over in the book of Revelation. And the vision of the evenings and mornings which was told is true. Therefore, seal up the vision. Now, he says to seal up the vision, but in the book of Revelation, he tells John not to seal it up. So it's kind of being unsealed today in which we live, but it was kind of sealed up back in that day. And he said, I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days, because afterwards I arose and went about the king's business. I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it. That's easy to understand that they didn't. Seal it up, he said. It's a future fulfillment. And note that in Revelations 22:10, John is told, do not seal the words of the prophecy of this book. Don't seal them up, for the time is at hand. Don't seal them up now because it's unfolding before your very eyes. You need to understand what's going on. And so we have all of this. We have the response. Daniel was sick for days. It was a vision that was exhausting. I mean, even this morning, as if you've never heard of prophecy or any of this kind of teaching, you think, man, I don't understand this stuff. This is Greek to me. No, it's Hebrew, actually. See? Got you. All right. All right. Yeah. You'll laugh after a while. Anyway. I'm a little slow this one, right? He went back to the service to the king. In other words, went back to business, you know. But he kept these things. He kept thinking about these things in his mind, and he was really astonished by them. And here's why I think he did. No one understood it. He didn't have anybody to talk to about it. See, I think that where Daniel lived and where you and I are now, there was like this big mountain. And Daniel could see to the top of the mountain. What he saw on the top of the mountain was the cross. And that was the death, the burial, resurrection of Jesus Christ. And all he could see beyond the cross was another mountain, and that was the second coming of Christ. Daniel understood that, but he didn't understand that big valley in between called the church age. The last 2,000 years, we've been between these two mountains, the mountains of the first coming of Christ and this mountain that is coming, the second coming of Christ. And you and I are now that big 2,000-year period of time. And Daniel said, I don't understand what's going on. I don't understand what's going on between the first time that he comes and the second time that he comes. And so there's this group that Daniel didn't understand that's called the called out group or the church. And that's you and I. That's number one. He didn't understand Israel, what was going to happen to Israel, how they was going to be destroyed, 70 A.D., remember that? The Roman emperor came in 70 A.D. and sacked Jerusalem, spread all the people out to that day. The people came back to their country back in 1938. Remember that? All this stuff is going on in our time. And he didn't understand anything about the times of the Gentiles. You and I, by and large, we're all Gentile here. Except for Mariah, she's Indian. That's no different, right? She's from a different tribe, right? I didn't know she was Indian. She gave me something. She took it back. I'm trying. All right. So you got the church. You got Israel. Right? And you got Gentiles, and Daniel's like, man, I don't understand any of that. This is all going on between these two big mountains. And he looked across the mountains of time, and he could only see those two big peaks. That was the cross, and that was the second coming. But he didn't know anything about the rapture. He didn't understand anything about the 7 years of tribulation. But here is Gabriel telling Daniel about the tribulation period. He's telling him about those 2,300 days, telling him about those 6 and almost 7 years there, that this massive persecution would take place, and that the 7 years would be cut short, because if Jesus didn't come back during the tribulation period, we'd all die that's left here. But because he doesn't want that, he's going to come back in the second half of the Great Tribulation, and he's going to have this big war in the Valley of Megiddo over there in the Middle East. And some of you may be living. If you take care of your health, eat right, drink right, sleep right, do all those things, you might live to be as old as I am. And if you're real lucky, you'll be old as Ben is. Right? Right? Take care of yourself. Right? Let's stand together this morning. Altar's open this morning. If you got anything on your heart this morning, something been bugging you, something, if you need an anointing, Brother Ben's going to help me here with the anointing.